Hey guys, I want to talk to y'all about a sci-fi show today. By the time the 1960s ended, people were into sci-fi, and the genre had produced a lot of great content. When people talked about science fiction on television back then, they usually started with the same names. Star Trek, Doctor Who, The Outer Limits, maybe Dune if we're talking about books. But before this, there was a short window where TV tried something different with sci-fi, and that's where the show we're talking about today comes in. Space 1999. So sit back and enjoy as we dive into a video on a beloved show that drifted away. To be honest, I've always found the premise of the show to be very oddly blunt. The moon gets blasted out of Earth's orbit. That's it. The people who live here are cut loose from home and they're forced to drift through space. It premiered on September 4th, 1975, and honestly, it was extremely ambitious for television at that time. Moonbase Alpha is cut off, fully aware that Earth is gone and there's no clear path back, and the series keeps returning to that. It made it feel very different from most television sci-fi at the time. A lot of TV shows in the mid-1970s relied on momentum and reassurance, where even bigger threats were framed as things that could be contained or overcome. Space 1999 kind of moves in the opposite direction. It slows down and lets the people involved sit with the reality of their situation. Some episodes barely feel interested in giving you a clean resolution at all. This was Jerry and Sylvia Anderson's final live-action television series, and it had a sense of ambition that was hard to miss. The sets were large, the production values were big for the time, and everything about it suggested a wish to treat science fiction as something closer to cinema than comfort television. A lot of the visual design and pre-production work for Space 1999 carried over from the Andersons' abandoned plans for a second season of UFO, which itself leaned heavily into a colder, more grounded vision of science fiction, and the influence of 2001: A Space Odyssey is all over the show. Compared to what else was airing, Space 1999 felt far less interested in making itself easy to watch. And I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now. You're probably sitting there wondering why I'm making this sound so heavy, because in your head, this is still just a sci-fi show you can catch on TV once in a while. But that heaviness is also why Space 1999 hit so differently when I was a kid. I didn't have a problem with science fiction. I watched plenty of it, but this show did not go the way I expected a TV series to go. A lot of the time, it felt like it was moving at its own pace, whether I was ready for it or not, and that made it feel strangely more serious compared to everything else I was watching. Even when nothing terrible happened, the situation itself never improved. Let me elaborate on the premise for you guys once. Humanity has basically built a huge scientific research station on the moon called Moonbase Alpha, set inside a lunar crater. At the same time, Earth has been quietly dumping its nuclear waste on the far side of the moon, treating it like a cosmic landfill because, well, it's far away and out of sight. Also, very on brand for humanity. Always so careless about dumping waste. Well, surprise, surprise, this very decision comes back to haunt. They so should have expected this, though. On September 13th, 1999, something goes wrong. An unknown form of magnetic radiation interacts with the nuclear waste, triggering a massive chain reaction. The blast does not destroy the moon. Instead, it does something worse. It knocks the moon completely out of Earth's orbit. And from that moment on, everything changes. The moon gets hurled into deep space at tremendous speed, taking Moonbase Alpha and its 311 personnel along for the ride. They're completely unreachable. The moon becomes their vehicle now, and they're trapped there and are drifting wherever physics and chance happen to take them. As the series goes on, the moon moves deeper and deeper into space, passing through phenomena like black holes and mysterious space warps that push it even deeper into the unknown. Along the way, the crew encounters alien civilizations, strange societies, and phenomena that do not always behave according to human logic or understanding. So what really happened to this show? I'll give you guys a little context first about why this show is kind of different. When you look at science fiction in the 1960s, and this is something I only really noticed later on, you can see pretty quickly why people remember that decade as hopeful. And a huge part of that comes down to Star Trek, the original series, because that show lands right in the middle of the space race era, when rockets were actually going up. Technology was moving fast, and a lot of people genuinely believed the future was going to be bigger and cleaner and more advanced than the present. Television reflected this. Stories were more about rescue missions, moral lessons, and allegories about society. But they usually ended with the feeling that humanity was going to figure things out eventually. Sounds pretty hopeful, right? If you jump over to Britain during that same stretch of time, you see the same forward-looking mindset inside Jerry Anderson's earlier shows. Supercar, Thunderbirds, The Secret Service. All of these shows are built around the idea that technology works when people use it properly, that the systems we have exist for a reason, and that smart, organized teams can solve problems before things just spiral out of control. A lot of people grew up with those shows shaping how they imagined the future, where machines were reliable, institutions were stable, and progress felt automatic. Then the mid-1970s showed up, and suddenly Anderson is making Space 1999, and the tone is suddenly so jarring. Instead of a future where humanity is expanding onward in a controlled way, this show drops you straight into a situation where humanity loses control in one moment and never gets it back. What makes the first episode hit even harder is how it sets up the expectation of progress before ripping it away from us. Humanity is preparing to explore a planet called Meta, another achievement. Then the pilots meant to lead that mission end up brain dead in sickbay. Commander John Koenig, played by Martin Landau, knows these people personally, and you can literally see him realizing that the next big step for humanity has basically died right in front of him. From here on out, the storytelling is so cinematic, and the performances of the actors also felt very restrained and stiff to me sometimes. The pace of the show is also kinda slow, but I personally think that it works better that way. It feels like the Andersons wanted to explore all these metaphysical ideas first, and not just focus on the whole spectacle of it all, especially in the first season, because you don't get the constant laser battles in space or giant wars happening all the time the way this genre usually does. Instead, you get stories that are built around concepts and consequences. The way they tell these stories also has a lot of influence from the philosophical sci-fi that was big in the 70s. An episode called A Matter of Life and Death is a good way to explain this to you guys. So in this one, the crew finds a planet where people encounter versions of loved ones who've already died. Dr. Russell meets her husband, who explains that he's a duplicate formed from the same energy pattern, but not truly the same person. This is a heavy idea to drop into what many viewers probably expected to be a weekly adventure show. And I can already imagine some people who are watching this thinking, I signed up for space exploration, not a lecture about identity or physics. And honestly, this reaction would make so much sense because this was a lot, especially for a show trying to break into the American market. The audience is there like a faster pace and more action. But season 1 kept talking about bigger ideas. In the episode Black Sun, the moon gets pulled towards a black hole, and instead of turning it into a simple escape story, the episode talks about theories in physics and uncertainty, and even hints at the idea that the crew might have encountered something beyond human understanding during the process. There's even an episode where the whole crew has been regressed to earlier stages of evolution. Isn't that just crazy? Could you guys kind of see why people had different opinions about this show? Because for some of them, this is exactly what they wanted from a science fiction show. Something that uses space and asks questions about identity, about survival and human nature, while using actual science. But for others, this just felt like too much, because the show was more interested in the ideas than in action. And when you look at the show through that lens, it makes a lot more sense why Space 1999 still feels strange compared to most sci-fi television that came before it or after it, because it was trying to do something television did not always know how to support. I personally really enjoyed season 1 because I love talking about things like this. As much as I like action, I'm also drawn to ideas like this a lot. But then season 2 happened and it was just so off. I cannot think of a better way to put that because the tone just changed. The very thing that drew me into this show started drifting away. So after season 1, things were shaky for a while, but eventually it got the green light. There were some changes that took place. When all this was happening, things between Sylvia and Jerry Anderson didn't work out, and Jerry ended up being the only producer, and with him we got a new showrunner, Fred Freiberg. Now, we all know this guy. He already had a reputation following him around from Star Trek. A lot of fans still blame him for the drop in quality during that show's 3rd season, and now he's brought in here with a pretty clear mission, which was to push Space 1999 closer to something American audiences would connect with more easily. That mostly meant changing the storytelling, a faster pace, more action, and basically making this slower and less philosophical. To me, this took away the essence of the show. I kind of liked the different approach it had in the first season. This change really did not blend well with what was already established in season 1, which was built around ideas. But suddenly, season 2 was leaning way more on action in a way more traditional way of telling science fiction stories. And when you watch those 2 seasons back to back, you can very clearly notice this change. The show did not really evolve into the new season. It felt more like an abrupt shift where 2 different kinds of shows were trying to occupy the same space. And the ratings did not really improve enough to justify these changes either, which is the part that always annoys me, because the whole point of changing direction was to make the show more accessible. Instead, you now ended up with this weird middle ground where a lot of first season fans felt pushed away because the tone changed too much, while new viewers are still not fully committing to it. So now you've got a show trying to appeal to everyone and not quite working for any one group strongly enough to carry it forward. One of the genuinely interesting additions during this phase is Maya, the alien character played by Catherine Schell, because she actually brings something new to the dynamic. She can transform into other life forms, which opens up storytelling options that didn't exist before, and you can now tell the show is trying to build around her. But at the same time, there are moments where it feels like too much responsibility is being pushed onto that character to carry the emotional or narrative weight of the series. And that's a lot to put on one new addition when the rest of the show is still trying to figure out what it wants to be now. And then you have the characters who disappear without much explanation, which was really not okay with the fans, especially when you're talking about people who were part of the show's identity early on. Victor Bergman, gone. Paul Morrow, gone. And David Kato, also gone. And the show never really explains why they're gone. These things make the transition feel even more abrupt if you were really invested in the characters from the beginning, which I was, by the way. Even with all the chaos happening, there were still conversations going on about a 3rd season, which is a little wild when you think about it. The idea was to shorten it to 13 episodes to save money, which already tells you the budget pressure was real at that point. And there were also talks about doing a Maya spin-off series. Now, there was no clear direction of what would happen in this spin-off, whether she would have left Moonbase Alpha or if the 2 shows would have run side by side. But the fact that those conversations were happening tells you people still believe there was something worth salvaging here. Then the news of the cancellation came up in the US, and a lot of fans tried to stop this. People pushed for it to come back. They kept talking about it for years. But unlike what happened with Star Trek, where fan momentum eventually helped revive the franchise, that never happened here. I want to talk to you guys a little about how the UK was during the 1970s, because that also had to do with how people received the show. So let me get right into it. Because when people talk about the 70s in Britain, they don't usually talk about it as a comfortable or stable period. It was a decade tied to economic decline, unemployment spikes, financial crisis, and constant labor strikes. There were actual moments where the country was dealing with states of emergency. Power cuts left people sitting in darkness. Garbage literally piled up in the streets. Panic became a normal thing. Commercial television went off the air for months at one point. Major newspapers disappeared for long stretches. There were even moments where basic services failed badly enough that bodies weren't being buried on time. And until Britain worked out a deal with the IMF, there were real factors about the country sliding towards bankruptcy. Crime was rising too. The systems people trusted were starting to break down. And then there was housing. By the early 1970s, a lot of people were living in huge post-war blocks, and they were supposed to represent the future of urban living. In theory, these spaces were meant to be modern and efficient, but in reality, a lot of them were built cheaply, placed far from services, and maintained badly. If you put that cultural context next to Space 1999, suddenly some of the ideas in the show doesn't feel like it came out of nowhere. The production itself was affected by what was happening in Britain at the time. The first 24 episodes took about 15 months to finish, and a lot of that delay came from industrial disputes and power shortages. So the instability that people were living through was literally affecting the show while it was being made. There was the Cold War on top of this. A lot of sci-fi back then was dealing with fears about total destruction, nuclear disasters, governments losing control, technology getting ahead of ethics, and the idea that maybe survival depended on strong leadership and strict structure. The whole disaster that starts Space 1999 comes from politicians' mishandling of nuclear waste, which is directly related to the environmental fears and political distrust during that time. Even Moonbase Alpha itself feels like it comes from that mindset. It's supposed to represent humanity pushing forward, planning for survival, exploring new worlds. At the same time, it's tied to monitoring nuclear waste storage. The base is also a reminder that humanity is creating problems it does not fully know how to manage. And this is something I've honestly wondered about a lot. And I'm not saying this was the reason the show struggled, but I do think it might have been part of the picture. Because if you were living in Britain in the 1970s, or even just watching the news back then, you were already dealing with a world that felt unstable. So then you sit down to watch science fiction, which for a lot of people was supposed to be their escape. And instead, you get a show about people trapped in a situation they can't fix, cut off from home, living with consequences caused by political and technological mistakes. I can imagine that for some viewers it was probably fascinating, but for others, it might have felt a little too close to real life to be comfortable. And that doesn't mean the show was doing anything wrong. If anything, it means it was honest. But honest science fiction does not always become a comfy watch after a long day. So, if Space 1999 had ambition, if it had scale, if it had fans who clearly cared about it, then why did it not turn into something bigger? Why did it not become one of those science fiction franchises that just keeps going forever? I think part of that answer can be found in the premise itself, because the show is built around survival, not exploration. Star Trek works long-term because the Enterprise is on a mission. They're out there to discover, to negotiate, to explore. That structure gives you infinite stories. You can go to a new planet every week and it makes sense. Space 1999 does not really have that. They're reacting to whatever they run into, and that makes for great existential storytelling, but it makes long-term franchising a lot harder because you can't easily build spin-offs around we are lost and hoping we survive. And then there's the cost. This was an expensive show for television at the time. The sets were big, the models were detailed, the effects work was ambitious. And all of that is amazing when you're trying to make something cinematic. But it also means you need massive, consistent ratings to justify keeping it alive. And when the audience itself is split between people who love the philosophical tone and people who wanted something faster and more action-driven, it becomes really hard to build the stable audience you need to turn a show into a franchise. And timing really matters here too, because by the late 1970s, science fiction was changing. Star Wars comes by, and things become more merchandise-friendly. You have clear heroes, clear villains, big emotional arcs, things you can build toys and spin-offs and expanded stories around. Space 1999 doesn't really fit into that. And sometimes I think we forget that not every show is built to become a universe. Also, the way it ended, there was no big farewell moment, no proper closure, no final episode that everyone remembers, or a great cliffhanger that haunted people for years. When you step back and look at all of this together, I don't really think Space 1999 failed in the way that people sometimes look at it. Maybe nothing dramatic happened. Maybe the show just slowly drifted out of sync with where television was going. And honestly, there's something weirdly fitting about that for a show that's literally about people drifting through space trying to survive in a universe that doesn't really care where they end up. And maybe that's exactly why people still remember it. Some of you might think the show deserved more, that it should have lasted longer, and I get that. I really did love the whole existential vibe the first season had. I would have loved to have more of that. The ideas that it dealt with, it really should have had a nicer legacy. But sometimes television just doesn't work like that. Sometimes a show shows up at the exact wrong moment culturally, even if creatively it's doing something really interesting. And Space 1999 feels like one of those shows that showed up right in the middle of when science fiction was changing shape, when audiences were more interested in shows like Star Trek and Star Wars. And here comes this show that just asks you to live with uncertainty for an hour every week. That's a hard sell, even now. Back then, it was probably even harder. And I think that's why this show is remembered the way it is. Not as this giant franchise that took over everything, but as something people experienced emotionally while watching this. Space 1999 never really tried to make space feel safe. It never promised you the crew would find a way home. It just kept asking, what happens when you lose control of your future and have to keep going anyway? And honestly, that question still feels relevant now, which is probably why people keep coming back to this show even decades later, even if it never became a massive franchise machine. Or at least that's why I keep coming back to it still. Well, I've talked about this way too much now. I'd like to get your thoughts on all this. If a show like this came out today, would you guys be into it? Or would it get labeled as boring or too heavy before it had a chance to find its audience? And this is something I'm really curious about. Do you think Space 1999 would have been remembered differently if it had gotten one more season, or a proper ending, or a big finale moment that everyone talked about? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed watching this video, do like, share, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell icon for us. Thanks for sticking around to the end, and don't forget to stay marvelous.